Okay, this video is going to be an introduction to some of the ways we're going to be using basic elements throughout the class, throughout your career as an artist. And we're warming up for one of our projects that focuses on the elements, Zentangles. So we like to start with line. So I'm going to be talking in this video about line variation. Or line variety, or variation of line. And I'm trying to demonstrate that a little bit with what I'm doing right here in just writing those words. Just to give you a little sneak preview, we will be working with Zentangles, and so these are just some examples of this art form that focuses on pattern. It's often black and white. And we're using these basic elements of line, shape, and value primarily. And we'll be talking about form a little bit as well. Okay, so as I'm doing this tutorial, I'm going to be focusing on some of the materials we're going to be using. So I started out with my Crayola marker, and I did that because you can really get this variation in line from thin to thick just by using different parts of this marker in one line or in separate lines. But we'll be using, probably more than that, we'll be using some of our narrower pens and markers, such as these ones here. So I've got my permanent Sharpie with the ultra fine tip, and you can see even with these small tips, I can still get that variation in line. And you can practice that a little bit. Got my thicker permanent marker, and again, you can get that variation in line. Then we get into our detail pens, so a little bit of line variation with the fine liner. So this one is not permanent. It's a felt tip, and that will bleed with some water, so just keep that in mind. Our ballpoint pen, one of my favorites to start a design because you can get different values just from applying a different amount of pressure to that. So if you are starting something with this ballpoint pen because you know that you can get a fine line with that and it's a little bit lighter, you might then go back and add line variety. You could add it with this same material. I'm now making this line appear to go from thick to thin, just filling something in like that. You can also start with this thinner tip and then switch to something thicker, filling that in, and or going over part of the line. Alright, so you can play with those. We're not going to be using our blue ballpoint pen. We're going to be keeping this primarily black and white, or for the most part all black and white. We will be using our gel tips though. So those are some of the materials we're going to use. Alright, moving on to some of the other skills I want you to have and know about before we start our first real assignment. I'm going to work with some of my graphite pencils now, but I'm going to be talking about using shape and form. So this may be information you already know. You may have learned how to create a cube, maybe in elementary school. So if I'm starting with a square, something like that, and I want to turn that flat square into a cube, I can make another square the same size and shape, a little bit higher up and to the side, and that's going to give us the illusion that it's a little bit farther back in space. And then I'm going to connect the dots for the corners. And the idea is here that this line is parallel to this line, And this line should be parallel to that line here. Those two are parallel. So I'm going to try to adjust a little bit if I need to. So there I've got a cube that looks like a glass cube because it is see-through. And so to make that stand out a little bit more, I can go over some of these lines. And I'm only going to go over the lines that would show if this were made of a material that were opaque. So I could then erase these lines if I want that to become a cube that's wood or cardboard, any other material. So shape to form is what we are doing right now, starting with our square. And parallel projection is the name of this technique. So this is a little bit different than linear perspective, which we will be learning later in the semester. There's another way to make a box that is a similar technique, but looking at the angle, looking at it from an angle. So I would start with a line right in front of us, the corner of the box, and then create an angle like so with the two sides. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to have the same angle. So this is parallel and this is parallel. And that's parallel and that's parallel up here. And then filling this in. So something like this. So you've got this kind of diamond shape as the top of the box there. So filling that in. And this is based on that same idea that we're basically just thinking about this as we've got our plane here, and then the plane back here is just parallel to that. All right, so this, when it's at an angle like this, it's isometric. So isometric projection, or you might see that called isometric perspective as well. So continuing with this idea of shape to form, and this idea of these parallel surfaces, we can do this same basic idea with a cylinder. So when you have a circle and you see that on the side, so you see that at an angle, so when we're looking at a circle like the top of this jar, it's a circle, but then when we're looking at it from an angle, we start to see this shape that looks a little more like an oval. We call that an ellipse. So something like that. So that would be the top of our cylinder or our jar. And then we're going to create another one right down here. So we're making these two lines parallel to each other. And we can make that ellipse the same down here. And then we'll erase this part, because we wouldn't see that bottom plane if it is sitting on a table. On the other hand, if this were floating up in the air, if we wanted to make that look like it were above our eye level, we could see the bottom part of that. And we wouldn't see the top plane. So that top plane would be in there, but we wouldn't see it. All right, so we've got our cylinders. And then finally, same idea, we can do a cone, just creating that ellipse shape at the bottom, and then adding a triangle on top. So I'll make two versions. So to make this look like it's above your eye level, you would keep that whole entire bottom plane to make this look like it's sitting on a table. I would erase that back edge of that ellipse. And then I could add a little shadow down here to reinforce that idea that it's sitting on a table. Okay, so we've got some different forms now that you know how to make. I've got my circle over here. To turn that into a form, we need to add a little bit of shading. That's the only way to turn this into a sphere. So going over that line so that you can see it a little bit more. And I can do this shading in a few different ways. So I'm going to start with some ones just using my pen or felt tip marker here. So this will be the side of the ball that's in shadow. So my light source would be coming from here. And I'm adding some shading over on the opposite side. And that's going to go from darker here to lighter over here. And the technique that I'm using is called stippling. I'm just using lots of little dots. I'm going to switch my material to my ultrafine Sharpie, which maybe you can see a little bit more clearly. So the closer I put these dots together, the darker that value appears. And then as I spread them apart, then it appears lighter and lighter. And that also, I can do that with even more subtlety by maybe shifting from a larger tip pen like this one, or marker technically, to one that makes smaller marks. So the less ink, the lighter it is. So something like that. There are other ways too that I can shade. So another circle that I want to turn into a sphere. So we could also use hatching. So hatching is using line. I'm going to do some to these other shapes too. So notice as I start my hatching, I'm going to start with lines that follow the edges of the form. So I was using curving lines here for my sphere and vertical lines for my cube. If I want to keep making this darker, the same idea that I used with the stippling, the closer these are together, the darker it's going to look. So I could keep going with the hatching, just going one direction, but I'll often use cross hatching, so use lines that cross the first lines. And so notice I'm continuing to use lines that work with the form. So I'm using diagonal lines that match these diagonal edges of that form. So if I were doing that with this shape down here, these curving lines. And there's no rule that you can only use one of these at a time. I could go from hatching and cross hatching to then switching over to stippling, which lets me fade out more slowly. All right, and then we have the classic. We'll use our pencil as well, so starting with my sphere, my circle again that I want to turn into a sphere, I can use my pencil to create a shadow. So I'm using my 2B pencil right now because it's light enough that I was able to erase that when I wanted to, but I can also press a little bit harder for for darker shadows. So when you're shading, a lot of people go straight to blending with their finger, or maybe using a paper towel or a tortillon to blend, but I want to encourage you to use the pencil itself first to create a smooth gradation of value. So I'm pressing harder, I'm using small marks, and then I can use a lighter touch, not go over these as much, and get a range of value before I even start to blend this by smearing it. And that's a good habit to get into. It's a good skill to learn, because not all materials are blendable in the sense that you can smudge them. When you are ready to blend this by smudging, I strongly urge you, I will require you to get a piece of paper towel. I just ripped off a small bit, and I can make a really nice blending tool by just folding this over in half a bunch of times. Once you do that enough, it's going to start turning into a rectangle, even if it wasn't originally. And once this is pretty thick, has a little bit of stiffness to it, then I'm going to make a triangle. I could fold it over like this in the middle, or I could fold it over from one of the corners. Doesn't really matter, but I've got kind of a triangular tip, and I can use that to blend, even if I'm trying to do something with a lot of detail. So I was using the 2B pencil. The darker and softer your pencil, the easier it is to blend like this. So if it's not blending as much as you want, you could use a 4B or a 6B. On the other hand, it is possible to kind of go overboard with the blending. If you lose all of the white area, then you've gone overboard. So if you needed to, you could go back in and erase a little bit. And I can erase in sort of the same way that I did my stippling or my hatching. I can use just little marks if I just want to erase a little bit and get more of that smooth look to that. So to practice your gradation of value, if you're not able to make this really smooth gradation yet, practice that by creating this kind of triangular shape, or like a, what would that be? A less than sign, greater than sign. So create that, and then pick a pencil. So like I said, I'm using 2B, and try going from dark to light, making it totally smooth without smudging it with your finger or with your blending tool. So I'm using very small marks. I started by pressing a little harder and going over that more. Then I'm pressing lighter, lighter and lighter and lighter. And these are really small marks. Maybe 1/8 of an inch will get you a really smooth blend. And I say blend, but really I'm just talking about this smooth gradation without picking up any kind of tool or smudging it at all. So try that out, see if you can do it. You can switch pencils as you go. I did not. See how much you can do with just one pencil, but then if you want to, you can also see what happens if you go darker with your pencil. If you can't get this as light as you want here, so it's just fading out, you can try switching to your lightest HB pencil and see what that does. So we've gone through most of the different things that I wanted to talk about. I want to talk a little bit about some different materials that you can use to create line particularly. So one of those that we haven't talked about is your eraser. So I'm going to use my graphite stick in this case to shade a larger area. And I can blend that a little bit as well. And then I can actually create line by erasing. So just another thing to think about, another way to create line. If you want to try that with some of your other materials, you can. So your darker charcoal, see what happens. So this is one of the reasons I gave you a bunch of different erasers. So this is now going to be, of course, have some dirt on it, so you'd want to clean that off before using it on a nice clean pencil drawing, and I do that just by erasing with it a little bit, so that's actually cleaning it off a bit. But that could also just be your eraser now that you use with some darker materials. And another great material for getting some line variation is actually your brush. So get out your watercolors, get out your water here, your water cup. I do like to have some extra paper towel whenever I'm working with water and paint. And so just getting a dark color on here to activate this, you get this nice and wet, and get your brush in there. So I'm not smushing the brush. You want to keep this nice tip on the brush, especially for what we're about to do. And then we can use our brush to draw a line that really easily goes from thin to thick. If you want that to match this kind of Zentangle black and white palette, you can try that out with your brush. Do some different designs. And then finally, since we've got the water out, I'm going to use some of my Crayola markers, the washable markers. And so back at the beginning, we were doing some line variation with our washable markers. So I'm going to do that a little bit more. And just want to play with this a little bit with the water and demonstrate how if you add a little bit of water, you can get this really beautiful wash effect, very much like using watercolor. So if you aren't planning for it and you don't want this to happen, that would be a nightmare. But if you wanted that to happen, this can be a really lovely technique that you can use on purpose. And then if I add a little bit of that water to a wet area like this, that blurs that as well. So this was my watercolor over here. So just to recap, we started with line variation, changing the type of line from thin to thick, light to dark. We talked about shape to form, so turning a square into a cube. We used parallel projection. We used isometric projection when we were looking at the edge. And then we also talked about different ways of shading. So we used hatching when we were just using lines. Cross hatching was the variation where the lines crossed each other. We used stippling with little dots, and we used a smooth gradation of value.